the question of authenticity very important. This question was initially raised as a result of disputes that raged between political factions such as the Shia and the Umayyads, and later on the Shia and the Abbasids. And one finds, when one looks at Islamic history, that each side in this dispute is putting forth different hadiths, supposedly from the Prophet ﷺ, buttressing their own claims. However, other important questions were also raised having to do with the application of the Prophet's sunnah to business. There's a wide-ranging debate that has yet to be resolved today over the definition of the term riba. Is riba interest in general, or is riba excessive interest? Does it refer only to loan sharking, which is what was practiced in Mecca at the time of the Prophet before the coming of Islam? Again, there's no consensus on this yet. Eventually, schools were created that proposed different solutions to the problem of deriving rules from traditional sources. Imam Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanafi school of fiqh, felt that many hadith could not be verified. For this reason, he relied heavily on the text of the Quran and the logic of later jurists in setting the standards for Islamic conduct. By contrast, Imam Malik ibn Anas, the founder of the Maliki school, felt that the collective example of the Prophet's city of God in Medina was the best source to follow. His Al-Muwatta, or the Trodden Path, one of the earliest authoritative collections of Sunnah in Islamic history, contains as many references to actions of the Prophet's companions as to the Prophet himself. It was only with the publication of hadith in written form by Al-Bukhari, Muslim, and others of their generation that jurists such as Imam Shafi'i could reconcile the teachings of the Quran with those of the Sunnah in general. Imam Shafi'i is famous in the Muslim world as the founder of the science of usul fiqh. This is the plural of this word asl I was talking about, the roots of jurisprudence, the sources of jurisprudence, the foundations of jurisprudence. In his treatise or risala, he criticizes both the Hanafis and the Malikis for relying on non-prophetic opinions when the word of the Prophet himself can be used as a source of law. And again, he could make this claim only by asserting that it was possible in his generation to determine which hadith, which traditions of the Prophet were trustworthy and which were not. However, and this is the problem again, although Shafi and his followers continued to maintain that the Quran was the primary source of authority in Islam, the sheer volume of hadith, in other words, traditions of the Prophet in the various collections we have, so overshadowed in size and content the Quran itself that in time people began, especially some jurists, to spend more time talking about hadith than talking about Quran. If you find this point hard to believe, think of the last time that you had an argument or a disagreement or a debate with a fellow Muslim who was anti-Sufi, against tasawwuf. What kind of arguments does this person use against you? 9 times out of 10, the arguments that the person, say the Wahhabi type, the person who is against tasawwuf will use are arguments taken from hadith, not arguments from the Quran. This problem of, again, forgetting the sense of balance, getting to a point where one loves the Prophet so much that one forgets that the Prophet's actions were determined by the teachings of Allah and the revelations of Allah in the Quran, is what some Muslim reformers, for example, a 16th century Moroccan Sufi by the name of Abdul al-Habti, he called these people Muslim rabbis. Why did he call them rabbis, this Ahl Hadith type? He said they're rabbis because they are doing to the word of Allah what the Quran said the Jews did also to the word of Allah. They look at the letter without knowing the context. They look at the word without the meaning behind the word, and they begin to forbid what Allah himself did not forbid. And indeed, this is a problem we see today. This is a highly circular approach to knowledge. Because what we have is historically a situation where, again, so much attention is put on the hadith, so much attention is put on the word of the Prophet as opposed to the word of Allah, that even in later juridical traditions in Islam, the hadith itself or the techniques of hadith scholarship were used to verify the Quran. Can you imagine that there were scholars in Islam who actually said this? There are two types of hadith. There's hadith ahad, which is the weaker type, transmitted only by one person at some chain of transmission. And there's a stronger type of hadith called hadith mutawatir, which means there's more than one person at each chain of transmission. Can you imagine that some Muslim scholars said, we know the Quran is the word of Allah because all of its ayat are transmitted as hadith mutawatir? Well, technically that's correct. All of the ayat of the Quran do come down as a hadith mutawatira. But in terms of importance, this is putting the cart, as we say, before the horse. It's not hadith that makes the Quran true. It's the fact that the hadith resonates with the truth of the Quran that makes the hadith true. It's the other way around. So what do we have today? And again, this is not so much a problem with people who follow tasawwuf as with those who don't. A major advantage of tasawwuf is that this approach to Islamic theology and ethics has been uniquely able to preserve a sense of balance between the word of Allah and the sunnah of His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What has happened in today's generation, especially with this modern so-called Islamic fundamentalism, is that for all the best reasons, but without thinking things through, many sincere Muslims have unwittingly made themselves into Mohammedans instead of what we should say are called Ilahians. In other words, they tend to focus more on the details of hadith than they do on the word of Allah itself. Of course, there's another side of the coin. When you look in Islamic history, you can look at the falasifa, the philosophers of Islam, who made the opposite mistake. By relying on their own logic to interpret the Quran and not relying on the Sunnah hardly at all, they ignored the Prophet's example almost entirely. It is today, in my opinion at least, only in tasawwuf where one finds a middle way between these two extremes, where there is a sense of balance, proportion between the word of Allah and the teachings of His Prophet. And indeed, in my opinion, only by following tariqah can one's heart be engrossed in what some Sufis have called the divine harmonic of the word of Allah.